Now, I don't know how many of you are consider yourself to be a cat person or a dog person. I myself, I'm very much a cat person, and it seems like the demographic that fall under kind of the cat person and the dog person are mutually exclusive of one another, and they have very strong opinions about why one is better than the other. But I came across an article earlier this week that I think scores 1 point for those of you that are dog people. And it's an article talking about loyalty and how just kind of in our modern culture, the virtue of loyalty is considered to be irrelevant. And here's what the author said. I just thought it was a funny little quote that I wanted to share with you all. The author says, "The creature that seems to embody loyalty paradigmatically is not man, but dog. Dog loyalty is frequently stacked up against the pale, watery thing humans call loyalty, and we are found wanting. The lore on loyalty in the dog kingdom is replete with tales of self-sacrifice and undying devotion. The stories inevitably tug at the heart and moisten the eye, descending quite rapidly into pathos. And yet, there is that moment of truth, the dogged faithfulness we call loyalty." I'm guessing that was pun intended. Now, like I said before, the article goes on to observe that we as a culture have lost kind of this virtue of loyalty as something that we value. And the culture around us kind of spur us towards that end, right? We talk about things that you subscribe to with the option that is given that we can cancel out of it anytime we want. Cancel anytime, just subscribe. Right? We talk about ghosting, especially amongst the younger generation, as a completely legitimate way to end a relationship, without having to go through the difficult and awkward process of separating and having a sense of closure and processing the grief of loss. Right? Especially amongst the younger generation, job hopping is the norm. We change jobs as often as we change our outfits, let's say. And all of that is accelerated by our collective culture's deep suspicion towards any institution. Right? This extends into the way we think about organized religion. A lot of people talk about faith as something that is privatized within my heart. And we don't want to subscribe to any kind of organized religion, and we say, I'm spiritual, but not religious. Now, there may be some good kind of developments with some of these things that are happening. It gives us options and that kind of a thing. But on the whole, we're trained as a culture not towards devotion, but really towards curation. We like to leave our options. We like to experience as many things as possible, and we're the curators of our own life experience. And again, as there may be some good things that come out of that, but what inevitably results from that kind of development that devalues loyalty is that there's a hollowing out our capacity for real intimacy and a sense of belonging. Because any relationship that you go into has a hint of transactional nature to it. And there's always, when you walk into the front door, there's almost always the back door that is open just in case you want to experience something else. And so we've lost the sense of being able to give ourselves to intimate relationships, to experiencing real belonging. Because if we have the option of opting out at any time, whoever we give our heart to, whatever organization that we give our heart to, it follows that they have given themselves that option as well. So who knows who or what is going to stick around for the long haul? Now, the passage that we see here today is quite a different picture from that, isn't it? It's acts of these three mighty men. And it's a tale that comes towards the end of David's life. Now, it actually follows on the heels of David's last words. And this account happens quite earlier on in David's life, and it's as if the author is nostalgically looking back at David's life and highlighting one of the most precious moments of his life where some of his closest friends showed great devotion to him. And so that's what I want us to look at, this topic of loyalty or devotion. And I want us to learn what this means in our life. And we're going to learn 3 things about devotions that we're going to look at under 3 headings. First, we're going to see that devotion is sparked by desire. Secondly, that devotion is shown in risk. And lastly, that devotion is grounded in grace. Devotion is sparked by desire, shown in risk, and grounded in grace. So first, let's take a look at the first point. The devotion is sparked by desire. Let me give you a little bit of context here. Now we find David and his kind of platoon of soldiers hiding away in a cave called Adullam. Now, we're not quite sure when exactly this happened. It might have either happened while David was on the run from his political enemies, and so he and his kind of band of soldiers have gathered in this cave hiding out, or it might have happened at the height of David's kind of season in life where he was fighting all of these battles, and it might be one of the times in which he was fighting one of these battles. Now, either way, we know that David was away from his home, and he was beset on all sides by his enemies. And we know that his hometown of Bethlehem, Jerusalem, was taken over by his enemies so that he could not go back without great deal of risk to his safety. And so he's beset on all sides by his enemies. He has this longing for home. And so he says, our passage tells us, longingly, he says in verse 15, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem that is by the gate." Now, it's important for us to know here that this is a figure of speech. This was not a direct command. It's just a statement of longing. Right? It's just a way for him to express how much he missed home. And that was obvious to everybody around him, but how do the 3 mighty men respond to this wistful desire by their king? They respond by breaking through enemy lines and bringing the water back from Jerusalem. What we see is that these 3 mighty men responded not to David's command, but his longings. And that's the first thing that we learn. This is what true devotion looks like in any setting. When you're moved, not by the commands of another, but by their desire, by their longing. Now, my wife and I, if you include the time where we dated and 15 years of marriage, we've been together for 20 years. And I remember earlier on, when we started dating, one of the key things that I learned was this. My wife is really moved by kind of small acts of kindness, right? Little note that is left here or there, right? A single rose at a time, given to her at a time that she does not expect. And that was very, very difficult for me because you have to be kind of thinking about that all the time. What I would prefer are grand gestures coming at very kind of coordinated sets of time so I can plan for it and I can follow through on it. And we would go back and forth all the time, and she would basically say, "I want you to know what it is that I want, and I don't need to have to say it to you. I just want you to know." And I'm like, I'm not a mind reader, okay? It's very, very hard for me. But here's what I learned after years of being with her. What I learned was that what she was looking for me to be was not a mind reader, but a heart reader. And the kind of connection that she wanted to experience with me was one where you didn't need to speak, where there was a connection that was happening on the level of the heart. And I find that stereotypically that is truer for women, but the more I grow older, the more I learn about myself, the more I realize that though we have been conditioned to not think of ourselves in this way by the culture, we men, if you and I are being honest with ourselves, we want exactly the same thing. And it is true for every single person because it is an attribute of God that we have as image bearers of God. And it's illustrating for us the way in which God wants to relate to us. Hear this from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. This is God speaking. He says, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. There's a contrast between two things here. On the one hand, we have sacrifices and burnt offerings. Right? These are not unimportant things, but they're what you would call commands of God, the things that He explicitly told us to do. On the other hand, we have steadfast love and this intimate relational knowledge of God. What you would call the longings and the desires of God's heart that is on the heart level that does not need to be explicitly stated. And again, God would say, commands are important. They're not unimportant, but they take a back seat to my primary desire that I have in a relationship, which is for you to be in sync with my heart. And that illustrates for us the dynamic of the Christian life. The dynamic of the Christian life is this: as important as obedience to explicitly stated commands may be, it always takes a back seat before relationships. Relationship always comes before religion in the Christian life. Let me tell you what this means. If you go all the way back to the book of Exodus, we get the 10 commandments that are given to us, which is like the pinnacle of Christian ethical teaching. And it is given to us in Exodus chapter 20. Now, when the 10 commandments, when it's taught, it's almost always leaving out what is said before the 10 commandments are introduced, the preamble to the 10 commandments, the assumption, the foundation on which the 10 commandments are given. And it says this, Exodus 20 verse 2, it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is as if God is saying, look, I am going to give you the 10 commandments that I want you to follow for your flourishing, for your community's flourishing, and for the flourishing of the nations around you. I am about to give this ethical command to you, but before I give it to you, I want you to understand that before you lifted a finger, I need you to know that I am the God who did all of these things for you before you did anything for me. And friends, let me tell you that this is the distinguishing feature of Christianity that sets it apart from every other religion. Which is to say, as Tim Keller says, religion says, I obey, therefore I am accepted. While Christianity says, I'm accepted, therefore I obey. My friends, having gotten to know many of you, I know that many of you have grown up in the church. And we all kind of bring in kind of our own religious baggage and the assumptions that we have about Christianity. And whatever it is that you are bringing to the table, here's what I want you to know. And if I have to get this across to you over and over again for the rest of my life, I know that that will be time well spent, is for you to understand the difference between the two. The difference between Christianity and religion. Because here's the thing. If the good news of Jesus is reversed, if it's flipped, and you say, I obey so that I am accepted, then what results is an empty, lifeless, pathetic religion. You know, growing up, I despised organized religion. And in particular, I had a real strong distaste for Christianity, and even a greater distaste in particular towards Christians. Now, I have to admit, a lot of that was out of kind of youthful, rebellious hearts, whatever the case may be. Or maybe I was projecting my personal problems onto these people. But the thing that I said over and over again is that Christians are hypocrites. They're hypocrites. I think that's by and large true of every single one of us. But as I look back, I'm a Christian. Obviously, I'm a pastor. I'm a Christian. And as I think about my own hypocrisy, I notice that it's not so much that I fail to live up to the ethical standards that I espouse towards others. My hypocrisy, for the most part, lies in the fact that I am talking about and I claim to adhere to this thing that I do not experience for myself. I talk about the love of God all the time, and I don't feel it within myself. So here's what I do. I live life as if I know it. That's what a hypocrite is. Somebody who play acts. And so for most of our life, most of you that are Christians, I'm willing to bet that you don't experience the things that you say you believe in for most of your life. And you live life as if that is true, even when it is not experientially true for you. And as I look back, here's what I'm sensing. What I was intuitively catching on in my days of youth was that there's a whole bunch of people around me that tragically lived life without having their hearts in sync with God. And out of desperation, they lived strictly out of duty and not delight. I was seeing a whole bunch of people around me that connected to God and His commands, but not connected to His heart. And friends, here's the challenge that I want to give to you that you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life if you're thinking about your growth as a Christian. It's this fight to believe that you are accepted and that any obedience that comes out of that life is out of the full knowledge of your complete and unconditional acceptance in God. Here's why it's a challenge. Your heart and mine, we so easily snap back to works-based religion that tells us that we need to obey to earn His acceptance. You stretch out a rubber band, the moment you let it go, what happens? It snaps back into place. That's what our hearts do. And the fight of your Christian life is to fight against the grain of what your heart is telling you. To do battle against your heart, to say, God loves and accepts me. And any obedience is my efforts to connect, sync my desires with His. That is the fight of your life. Because true devotion is sparked by desire. But once you experience that, once your heart is connected with His, something powerful happens. And here's what I want to show you. The second thing is devotion is shown in risk. What happens in response to David's longing? We see in verse 16. Then the three mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate and carried and brought it back to David. It's basically the three mighty men saying, King David, your wish, O king, is my command. And so they go. Now, it is striking to me, the sequence of events here. The passage tells us that David longed, and in response, the mighty men broke through. Now, it may not come across in the English translation, but it's really this kind of violent, forceful language to describe what these men did. They would have had to burst through the gates, fighting off a whole platoon of soldiers. I mean, if you play the scene out, it's quite ridiculous what would have happened. One of the three men would have been useless in battle because he would have had to draw water from the well, while the two men are fighting off this impossible horde of soldiers that must have surrounded them, and they would have led. Can you imagine what their enemies would have thought? Like, wait, what just happened? They came in, they didn't loot us, they weren't interested in taking any of our treasures or killing us. They drew water and ran away. It would have made no sense whatsoever, and it still boggles my mind as I think about this scene, because it makes absolutely no sense. These three mighty men went on this kamikaze mission, and it was highly risky, Right? What were they doing all of that for? Here's the risk. David would have lost 3 of his most trusted generals that would have led them into battle, who would have strategized with them. Right? That's a great risk, even to his own life. What's the reward? It's water. It would have tasted no different from water. You know what I would have done? I would have said, let's go. 3 mighty men, let's go. I would have camped out in a nearby site where they can't see me for like 2 days, and I would have brought water back and say, "Oh, king, here's water from Bethlehem." You can't tell the difference. What is going on? It makes absolutely no sense. Completely unnecessary. It would have looked foolish to everyone around him. It was irresponsible. Here's what this reminds me of. The scene in the New Testament. Remember the scene in Mark chapter 14? Let me read it for you. It says, "As he, Jesus, was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they scolded her." And I read that and say, yeah, you could have fed the poor. And you just poured all of it on Jesus to say you didn't want to save any for later? See, real devotion almost always looks reckless to the people that are not involved. It would always look as if you threw caution to the wind. Friends, isn't that what true devotion in any context looks like? Like, you know what this is like if you've been in love. You do things that are ridiculous for the other person. But at the moment in which you are giving yourself over in these reckless acts of love, you know that whatever the world may think of you does not matter one bit. The only thing that matters to you is the person that you love. And you just look out the world and say, you just don't understand. Christian life is never meant to be calculated. A Christian life is not measured by safety or success, but in sacrificial, reckless love. There's a quote that is quite famous by now, said by a missionary named Jim Elliot. He got it from another person, but he made it kind of famous. And he says, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And I used to think for the longest time he's talking about some kind of treasure in heaven that he'll get as a reward for his act of faithfulness. He unfortunately died a tragic death getting speared by the natives that he was looking to reach in such an early age. And I thought about that quote. And you know, I've come to realize that when he talks about the thing that he cannot lose, he could not have been talking about any kind of external reward. He had to have been talking about the intimacy that he got to share with his God. Because there's nothing anybody ever does that is as dangerous and selfless and sacrificial that is not motivated by anything other than love. See, religious people treat God like a boss. They ask, like, what do I have to do so I can get right? Gospel people treat God like somebody that you're falling in love with. They don't wait around to be told what to do. You're constantly reading their body language. You're reading in between the lines. And you catch a whiff of their desires, and that springs you into action. And you say, I want to bend my will and bend my heart to be aligned with yours. A Christian says, take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. It's a joining of the hearts that a Christian desires. And when there is a joining of the hearts, there's no telling what a Christian would do. John chapter 14, verse 15, and Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And I, for a long time, thought about it as, if I love somebody, I'll do what they say. And I realized while that's partly true, I realize now how much it falls short to the reality of what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if you have seen my heart for you, if they're joining of the hearts between you and I, there's nothing that you won't do for me. And that's what Jesus is desiring. I hope it's painting a picture for you of what Christian life ought to look like. It is far more risky than you and I are accustomed to thinking about it. When's the last time you took a risk out of love for God? When's the last time you were detached from what you ought to do and you experienced obedience to God as something that you get to do? Because true devotion is shown in risk, not in safety. Now, if you're listening to that, you're like, okay. That lays quite heavy on me because as somebody who is called to be this Christian that encourages other people to live the Christian life, I now realize that it is far less safe and far more risky than I ever thought. And it forced me to a place where I was examining my own heart. Like, how am I viewing this Christian life? Like, I try to make sense of everything. I try to strategize. When's the last time I threw caution in the wind and followed after Jesus? And how am I supposed to talk about this and speak it into the lives of all of these people that are sitting in front of me? It's a hard thing to do. And that's where we need to talk about the last point. Because devotion, sparked by desire, is shown in risk, but ultimately is grounded in grace. Now here's the thing. Let me put it this way. Steph Curry, many of you may know, is a basketball player, professional basketball player, perhaps one of the greatest in kind of our modern generation. And there's a profile of him that came out, I believe it was in The Athletic, that talked about his leadership style. And if you know anything about Steph Curry, he's like obsessed with winning. He's maniacal about his craft. He shoots thousands of jumpers a day, perfecting his craft. He's obsessed with basketball. He's obsessed with winning. And for most athletes that are like that, the typical kind of caricature of an athlete like that is that they always carry a chip on their shoulder. Right? They would make up slights from other opposing players just to prove them wrong. Right? They're crazy driven like that. But Steph Curry is a little bit of an anomaly in that he is driven just as much as any other player that you come across, but he carries himself with a certain demeanor that's different from them. And the profile basically boils it down to one word: joy. It says the way he leads his team, the way he conducts his business, all driven by joy. He would happily risk his body diving after every loose ball, would give himself over to his craft, and he does it out of joy. And I look at that and say, that's what I want, not just for the things that I do, but in the ways that I follow God. I want to recklessly give myself over to God, and I want to do it all out of joy, but I have to admit, most of the times, I am measured in the ways that I follow Jesus because I just don't see the joy in it. All I see is loss. All I see is sacrifice. So what are we to do about all of this? Here's the answer. David receives this precious water, and what does he do? It says he would not drink of it. He poured it out to the Lord and said, "Far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives?" Therefore, again, it says he would not drink it. You go there and ask, like, what? These men went to the edge of death to bring you this water, and what do? You pour it out on the ground? What a waste! Except if you were there, if you knew the things that these men knew about David and the God of the Bible, you would know that that's not the case. Because when David pours it out, it tells us that David poured it out to God. He was pouring it out as a drink offering. And by doing so, David was not negating their sacrifice, he was honoring it. He was recognizing that something sacred had just taken place. And so he says in his heart, this sacred sacrifice, the sacred act of devotion is to such a degree that a mere human being cannot accept any of this. He's saying only God is deserving of such devotion. And that is true. Only God is deserving of this level of devotion. Only this God is deserving of having his people looking for his desires and acting upon it. And so here's the question that I want to pose to you. What is God's desire? And this, by the way, is where a lot of well-meaning Christians get tripped up. I've seen and heard accounts of Christians who thought that they heard from God and his desire and went and did something reckless to the utter destruction of their family and their life and even to their faith. And what I will say to that is they were acting reckless, not in line with God's desire, but in line with their own foolishness. Some of you may feel like, I've heard from God and I need to do this, and all these wise mentors around you are telling you that it is foolish, and I will tell you that you need to check your heart, because it is more likely than not that you are acting out of foolishness. Because God is a God of order and not disorder. God is a God of wisdom and not of foolishness. And so where do we go to discern what God's desire is? You need to go to the Scriptures. And let me encourage you to look into the Scriptures on your own to see all the ways in which God desires different things. But here's what's at the pinnacle of his desire. What's first and foremost for him. Jeremiah 32, verse 41. This is God speaking, by the way. And he says, I will rejoice in doing them good with all my heart and all my soul. Here's the God of the universe, pulsating within his perfect, infinite, eternal being is a desire to do good for his people. He's saying, with all my heart, with all my soul, with every fiber of my being, my desire is to do good for my people, he says. Come to the New Testament, more specifically, 1 Timothy 2 says, God desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of truth. Jesus, the Son of God himself, in praying to God the Father, says, Father, I desire that they also, talking about all the believers to come, they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am. God desires a lot of different things, but you know what he desires most? Is you. It's for you to have, for him to have your heart. For him to do good to you. That's his desire. Now, what did that lead him to do? It led him to do something utterly reckless. It led him to do something that is unspeakable. It led him to give himself in love for us. It's prophesied about in Isaiah 53. It says, he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. What was a reckless thing that he was led to do out of his love and his desire for you? Is to give himself over to death, and death on a cross. And what was welling up within his heart as he endured the pains of death? It was joy. Hebrews 12:2 says, "Look to Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." It is saying, Jesus despised the shame that came to him. All the people that scorned him, made fun of him, all the beatings and the lashings and the cross that he had to carry on his back, on which he was nailed, hands and feet. He endured all of that. Why? Because of the joy that was set before him, and knowing that that's how he was going to have you, in a way that made no sense to the entire world. It is a reality that 1 Peter tells us even the angels long to look into this reality, because it makes absolutely no sense to them, that the God of the universe would give himself in love for his people, his creation. And yet this is what he did. His sacrifice for you was joyful. Friends, I want you to sit with this, that in spite of all of your imperfection, all of your flaws, all of your sins, it wasn't as if God was sitting back and saying, "Oh my goodness, what do I do about this mess that I created? I guess the best thing that I can do is send my son Jesus, and I guess he's going to have to die on the cross because I need to win these people back so that the scales of justice in the cosmos can be balanced again." That's not what Jesus did. His heart was bound up with yours. He saw you in your longings. He saw in your desires. He saw you in your brokenness and said, "I will gladly be moved by the desires of my people so that I may win them back." Meditate on this reality and see what it does to your insecurities. See what it does to your sense of shame and guilt. See what it does to your fear. And see what it does to your heart. Friends, that's my desire for our church. God is calling our church to do some wonderful things that we've never witnessed before. How is that going to happen? It's not going to happen by a people that are driven by duty. It's going to happen through people that are driven by delight. And friends, would you give your heart over to God? Our culture is so filled with fear of commitment because we're so afraid of disappointment. Let me exhort you now to give your heart to a God who alone can never disappoint you, who alone will never forsake you, and have your heart be synced with His as you follow after Him in obedience. Let's pray.